Faculty of Law and Political Science at Bilkent University. His publications include Democratization and the Politics of Constitution Making in Turkey, and Islamism, Democracy and Liberalism in Turkey. Finally, Contemporary Turkish Politics, Challenges to Democracy, to Democratic Consolidation. In 2007, he chaired the academic committee appointed by the Turkish Prime Minister to draft a new civic constitution for Turkey. Also with us, Francis Raday, Professor of Law and Director of the Concord Research Institute for International Law in Israel at the College of Management, author of many books. I've mentioned only two which are most relevant: Women's Status in Law and Society in Israel and the Separation Barrier in the Disciplinary Analysis. And finally, our own Hanna Lemer, who completed her doctorate in political science at Columbia and is currently completing a book manuscript comparing constitution making in Israel, India, and Ireland. Okay, we'll have 20 minutes for each participant. We'll start with Professor Ozbudun, and his topic is Constitution Making in Deeply Divided Societies, Observation on the Turkish Case. Please.
First of all, I'd like to thank the organizers of this very interesting seminar, that is the Tel Aviv University. Personally, for me, it's always a pleasure to be back in Israel. 30 years ago, I had spent 2 very interesting and fruitful months at the Truman Institute of Hebrew University of Jerusalem, the rival institution, in a sense. I hope the rivalry is not as sharp as between Barcelona and Real Madrid. Anyway, first, let me say a few more general things about the divided society and the problems faced in the process of constitution making. We define divided societies as those deeply segmented by cleavages of racial, religious, or linguistic lines, each tending to create a subculture of its own. More than half a century ago, one of the giants of American political science, Gabriel Almond, had established a relationship between political cultural variables and the stability of democracy. In his view, a homogeneous political culture, and to him the best examples were Anglo-American democracies, were countries with homogeneous political culture. The subsystem autonomy was great, meaning that interest aggregation, interest articulation, communications, etc., each constituted a subsystem with a high degree of autonomy. Of course, when Almond wrote this 1956 article, he drew on the long tradition of American political science, emphasizing the importance of multiple membership in different social groups and the resulting cross pressures, which lead to a more moderate, more pragmatic political attitudes. That was the secret of the stability of Anglo-American democracies. At the other extreme were societies deeply divided by religious, ethnic, linguistic, sectarian cleavages, which, in the opinion of Almond and many others, did not lead to stable democracies. However, there is a category of certain smaller European countries, such as Switzerland, Austria, Netherlands, which are, in a way, deeply divided or segmented societies, and yet developed highly stable democracies. This kind of paradox has attracted the attention of many scholars, among whom, of course, Arendt Leipart is worth mentioning. He coined the term consociational democracy, which explains the long-term democratic stability of those exceptional European countries. Despite their segmented nature, they were able to develop a highly stable democracy. And the constitutional techniques or instruments of consociational democracy, again according to Arendt Leipart, are things like grand coalition, mutual vetoes, concurrent majorities, etc. Some of these techniques, of course, designed to protect the minorities, political and other minorities, against the unchecked power of majority, are also used widely in more homogeneous societies, less fragmented societies, such as a rigid constitution, resulting from it judicial review of constitutionality of laws, broad powers for local governments. If a minority is concentrated, geographically concentrated in a certain region of the country, maybe federalism or regionalism, these are the constitutional methods widely used in most democracies, whether they are segmented, divided, or more homogeneous, more unified. For constitutional democracies, of course, we need more specific methods, such as the ones I mentioned briefly, such as concurrent majorities or grand coalition. For example, the Austrian coalition after the Second World War. But these are more political arrangements than constitutional arrangements. You can hardly legislate it into the Constitution, a principle of grand coalition. For example, in Switzerland, it has been going on for a very long time. All four major parties are included in the Federal Council. But this is a matter of political agreement, not a rigid constitutional principle. Concurrent majority is also very difficult to accomplish. One example I remember from the Cyprus Constitution of 1960, which failed to operate and collapsed in 3 years, in 63. So some of these things are not so easy to introduce and to accomplish, although here and there we have examples of it. Others may be easier to be adopted, such as cultural rights, extensive cultural rights for linguistic and religious minorities, a wider degree of decentralization, sometimes bordering on regional arrangements. These are more common features to deal with the segmented society type democracies. So much for the theoretical introduction. When we turn to the Turkish case, the fundamental position of my paper is that the prevailing difficulties with the Turkish democracy and the constitutional system is that we are trying to implement a very monolithic notion of democracy in a highly pluralistic society. Let me explain. The predecessor of the Turkish Republic, the Ottoman Empire, was a textbook of a plural society, composed of different religions, different sects, different linguistic groups, etc. And on the whole, this system functioned fairly well until 19th century, let's say, until the rise of nationalism, especially among the nations of the Balkans. But the system worked more or less satisfactorily until that time as a result of the Ottoman millet system. Millet in Turkish means nation, but at that time it was used as a synonym for religious communities who were allowed to run their own affairs, religious, cultural, charitable, educational, health, welfare, and so on, pretty much through their own communal organizations. I am not saying that the Ottoman system was based on equality of all subjects in its current meaning. However, it gave those different communities a rather large area of operation. Maybe that was the secret for maintaining the unity of the empire for so many centuries. Towards the end of the empire, we witnessed the rise of Turkish nationalism, which continued with the declaration of the Republic. But in place of this so-called early multiculturalism, we had the rise of Turkish nationalism. Two, in my view, very unfortunate events made the population of the Turkish Republic much more homogeneous. One is the tragic deportation of the Armenians. The second is the exchange of population with Greece. In my opinion, even it was done in a peaceful way. It involved many personal tragedies, and it was against the long-term interests of both Greece and Turkey. At any rate, we had, in one way or the other, a more homogeneous society. But even after those two events, the deportation and the exchange of population, the Turkish society still had pluralistic characteristics. After the exchange of population, there was about 120,000 Greeks in Istanbul who were exempted from the exchange of population, like the Turks and other Muslims in Western Thrace, Eastern Thrace. Western, I am sorry, Eastern is our part. About 100,000 Jews and a similar number of Armenians. It is paradoxical and deplorable that after almost 80 years of a very militant secularism, the non-Muslim groups dwindled to an insignificant minority. There are only 3,000 Greeks left in Istanbul, maybe 60,000 or so Armenians, and about 20,000 Jews. Certainly, the notion of nationalism introduced by the Kemalist revolution was not racist, but it was cultural nationalism, and it insisted, and that you can see in the documents of Republican People's Party, the party Congress documents in the 1930s, that Turkish nation is defined as a population united in language, culture, and ideal. This is a formula not extremely favorable for the development of multiculturalism or a pluralistic society. It insists on unity of language and culture. And towards the 30s, that notion of nationalism, not openly but implicitly, also developed some ethnic characteristics. I don't want to go into details. What about the Constitution? As I said a few minutes ago, the problem of Turkish democracy here is that despite the presence of a rather plural society, and I'll explain why, Okay, 5 minutes. We tried to impose a rather centralized notion of nation state. Despite all these events, the present Turkish society still has pluralistic characteristics. For example, ethnically divided between Turks and Kurds. Kurds constitute about 15% of the population, although we don't know the exact percentages. The Muslims are divided between Sunni Muslims, Orthodox Muslims, and the Alevi heterodox minority. Again, the Alevis are estimated between 15 to 20%. Even more ominously, I would say, the Muslim Turks are divided between ultra-secularists who continue the tradition of the Atatürk revolution and religious conservatives who are represented by the present Turkish government, the government of the Justice and Development Party, AKP. Therefore, in a sense, this plurality has created its own subcultures, not to a very extreme point, but still, for example, the ultra-secularists have their own newspapers, read certain newspapers, watch certain TV channels. They maintain a certain very militant secularist discourse among themselves. For example, they hate headscarves and whatever. Then, on the other hand, we have more conservative Muslim groups, again with their own radio and TV networks, publishing houses, newspapers, and a discourse pretty much among themselves. Kurds are a separate group, and increasingly they are asserting their identity. So we have signs of multiculturalism and a fragmented political culture, although probably not to a very extreme degree, because still communication among different groups are possible to some extent. So, since I have very little time left, let me conclude. We need some consociational arrangements in order to have a more stable and more pluralistic democracy, to have a broader consensus based on the consent of the people. The way proceeded with the making of Constitution so far is a completely opposite method. All three constitutions of the Republican period, 1924, 1961, and 1982, were made by top-down methods, by assemblies not representing the people, but representing the privileges, interests, and values of the state elites. The first constitution of the Republic, 1924, was made by practically a single-party assembly dominated by Kemalists right after the War of Independence. And the two more recent ones were the products of military interventions, and neither of them was made by a broadly representative elected constituent assembly. On the contrary, in the bicameral so-called constituent assembly, because I believe they don't deserve that name, one chamber was the military committee that took over. The other so-called civilian chamber was either wholly appointed by the military committee or chosen by cooptative methods. At any rate, there is no question that they did not result from free competitive elections. So probably I'll stop at this point. The only way to resolve the difficulty, in the morning Professor Jacobson mentioned disharmonic situations. I think in the Turkish case there is a clear disharmony between the constitution in force and the realities of the society, social structure. So hopefully we'll in time devise some more consensual agreements, some more consensual methods to establish a constitution that will be based on the consent of all those different plural groups. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And now to Professor Bhargava, who will be talking about constitution and secularism in India.
Thank you very much, and thanks once again to Hanna and Azar for inviting me, and to all other members of the Tel Aviv University for making this stay here so congenial and wonderful. Okay, let me begin by giving a kind of historical background to Indian secularism. As you know, as India came closer and closer to its independence from British colonial rule, sadly, it became more and more deeply divided. By the 1940s, vocal sections of the Muslim elites, paranoid that a nation based on universal adult franchise would not only create a nation of Hindu majority, but will invariably have a Hindu state detrimental to Islam and to subcontinental Muslims. These elites had begun to raise the demand for a separate nation state, which was successful and which eventually became Pakistan. Now, this demand was part of and in response to what I described the creation of a majority-minority syndrome, which is a condition of spiraling estrangement between the Hindu majority and the Muslim minority. It's a condition where animosities between the two began to circulate freely, adding layers upon layers of mutual grievances, and apart from all the competition and rivalry over various resources, both material and symbolic, a kind of an antagonistic game had been set into motion, which had no aim in mind except the defeat and humiliation of the other. Of course, Muslim elites were not responsible exclusively for this. There were sections of Hindus, particularly those who had begun to articulate a very exclusivist ideal of Hindu nationalism, purely Hindu nationalism, and had begun to use a supremacist language, which would have definitely alienated the Muslims, right? But these kind of syndromes are always a product of both parties in some ways, and this syndrome did not get stalled after the independence. As a matter of fact, after independence, the Muslims that were left behind, and there were a very, very significant number. We're talking of, about 60 to 70 million people at that time, and now there are 120 million people, Muslims in India. I mean, they've been left after independence even more vulnerable. So the point that I'm making is that the situation was already very deeply divided, with constructions of narratives of deeply divided memory, Muslims being seen, all Muslims being seen as invaders by sections of the Hindus, and many Muslim elites imagining that there will be a creation of a Hindu nation and a Hindu state where Muslims will have less than second-class citizenship. So it was a deeply divided society, and there were prospects of what I call inter-religious domination, which were present, which had, there were some legitimate sort of fears of that. Okay, this, what I described as the majority-minority syndrome, had another consequence, and that is that in the 19th century, a whole variety of freedom and equality-centered reform movements had been initiated both among the Hindus and the Muslims. But what the majority-minority syndrome did was to set off, by this inter-religious rivalry, the syndrome which was set off by this inter-religious rivalry forestalled these reforms. The syndrome intensified the anti-reformist tendencies. The major leader of Dalits, B.R. Ambedkar, he sort of put this very eloquently. He said, and I quote, "When groups regard each other as a menace, all energies are spent on meeting this menace. The exigencies of a common front against one another generates a conspiracy of silence over social evils." So internal dissent and conflict was squashed in favor of the idea that everybody must close ranks or else the community will weaken. And once this kind of mentality sets in, then it's very difficult to have intra-religious reforms in both communities. So on the one hand, there was this prospect of inter-religious domination, and because of what I call the majority-minority syndrome, on the other hand, there was this prospect of intra-religious domination. And it's in this context of deep divisions, both intra-religious and inter-religious, that India had to make a choice of what kind of state it ought to have. And there were clearly two possibilities. One was to establish a Hindu majoritarian state that consolidates both forms of dominations, inter and intra-religious. And this was an easy option because Pakistan, the whole idea of Pakistan was mobilized on the basis of a separate Islamic nation, if not an Islamic state. It's certainly an Islamic nation. So this was one idea. The other was to have a very different kind of state, which had, I wouldn't say nothing to do with, because that would be too categorical. It certainly, which had, at least in the belief of a lot of people, it had nothing to do with this Hindu state. And it was set up to counter both inter-religious domination, the domination of Muslims by Hindus, and intra-religious domination, that is, domination by members of one religious community of members of other religious communities. So, for example, Dalits and women and so on, within Hinduism and within Islam, and within other religious communities in India. I think, by and large, I would say, and to their credit, India chose the second option. The national leaders in India chose the second option. And in doing so, they developed a very distinctive conception of secularism, which, in context of deep religious diversity, has enormous transcultural potential. So what was this state? The word secular is not mentioned in the Indian Constitution till 1975-76, when through an amendment the word secular was introduced. But there is absolutely no doubt that the character of the state was secular. And by secular, I mean politically secular. And by that I mean that A, it was non-theocratic, and B, it did not have any formal alliance with one or more than one religion. So it upheld what we might call the principle of non-establishment. So non-theocratic, no establishment, and that's what a secular state is, right? So that's the first point. But then, interestingly, I mean, this says very little, right? It says, in some sense, quite a lot, but in another sense, it doesn't really specify what the character of the secular state is. And I think the distinctiveness of Indian secularism comes when you examine the precise characterization of what Indian secularism is, or the kind of secular state it had installed there. So, what kind of a secular state was installed there? If you look at the conceptual structure of political secularism, or the conceptual structure of secular states, then very briefly and very simply you can say it espouses the separation of state from religion for certain ends. And I think you get multiple conceptions of secular states and multiple conceptions of secularism, depending upon how precisely you interpret or this idea of separation, or unpack the metaphor of separation, and how precisely you understand the ends for which this separation is to take place. Whether there is a single end or multiple ends, or whether these ends are amoral or moral and ethical, and so on. And it's how you interpret these ends and how you understand the idea of separation. It's this variable interpretation that leads to the generation of different kinds of secular states and different forms of secularism. Okay, so what is the character of Indians, secular? How did they understand separation? Well, there were two models, which were two models or two conceptions that are easily available to anybody. One is what I call the mutual exclusion model, which is typified in an ideal typical American version, although not only in the American version, and to some extent it's found in many other places. But it's ideal typically, you can say it's found in the American version. And what is that? That is that the state must not interfere in the affairs of religion, and religion must not interfere in the affairs of the state. So you must erect some kind of a wall of separation between the two. And that means that, if you look at it from the point of view of the state, leaving aside religion for the time being, it means that the state will neither help nor hinder religious activities. It will not subsidize anything, aid any religious community, or including religious minorities, even though these minorities may be very vulnerable, but it will not hinder anything religious. So, if some, I mean, this is only an extrapolation. It's not something which is true of any actual constitutional state, but it's ideally, if you want to follow the logic of the model. The logic of the model says that even if there is some deeply degrading practice which is developing within a religious community, that must be taken care of or mended by members of that community without the interference of the state. I'm not saying that everybody follows it, but that's the logic of the model. Okay, that's one understanding, and the Indian model completely rejected this idea, the mutual exclusion model. The other model is the one-sided exclusion model, which is the idea that religion cannot interfere in the affairs of the state, but the state can interfere in the affairs of religion. And this interference may be in the nature of help, or it may be in the nature of a hindrance, but in both cases, it's more or less to control the damn thing, right? Even helping is controlling in some ways. And that's the model that you find, again, in many places. But ideal, typically, I mean, as an ideal type, you can say that it's there in the French, probably the Turkish, although we have an expert sitting here. So, and of course, to an extreme, you may find them in many formal communist states. Okay, so what was this is also something that was rejected by India. So what is the Indian conception? The Indian conception is that we must follow what I call principal distance. what is principal distance? I mean, I'm not going to tell you which constitutional articles you must look at, because that's there in the paper, and that would be terribly boring, and you won't remember any of these articles anyway. But here is the idea. Principal distance is that you may engage with religion or you may disengage from it, and you may engage with religion positively or negatively. Positive engagement would be that you subsidize religion, you help religion, you recognize religious communities and you give them certain rights. For example, the right to set up and administer their own religious schools, and they may even get some aid from schools. So that would be perfectly okay. And you may hinder, not just help, but you may negatively engage with them, which is to say hinder them. So, for example, you can ban untouchability, because untouchability is a degrading practice, and you don't have to rely on Hindu elites. The state, which is a democratic state and which has a lot of Hindus in it, that state can take the decision and ban such a degrading practice as untouchability. And you can do this more than in one religion more than the other. So you don't have to be this, this very false kind of strict neutrality, that if you do something in one case, you've got to do it in the other case, and so on. You can do all that, depending on whether or not the strategy that you adopt will help the reduction of inter- and intra-religious dominations. So I'm going back to that point, right? So the main idea is you've got to attack these two forms of domination. In that sense, it's correct. Aggressive. You use the word aggressive. I won't call it aggressive in that sense, but yes, I got the spirit of it. It's sort of countering something. It's challenging something. It's an attack on these two forms of domination. And you don't have a fixation. You don't fetishize a strategy of wall of separation or one-sided exclusion. But it's a principal strategy because it's governed by certain substantive ends. You've got to make sure that somehow you cut down on, if you're not altogether eliminate, you reduce both forms of dominations. So what are these ends? Again, if you look at the ideal typical American or French model, whether one of abstract citizenship or not, the whole idea is that liberty and equality of and between citizens is seen individualistically, right? So formally, no rights can be granted to communities. But in the Indian model, you recognize individual rights, but you also recognize community rights, because the underlying idea is that both are important for human beings. That human beings want not to be part of communities, as well as they want to be part of communities, and that there is no way in which you can legislate antecedently that one will override the other in all cases for all times and so on. So the conflict has to be addressed from case to case rather than be decided antecedently through the Constitution. So you have both individual rights and community rights there, and it's something which has to be negotiated. Of course, there are certain rights which are never to be violated, right? But there are many other rights which have to be negotiated, in which negotiation both the legislature and the judiciary and various state and non-state actors will have to play some role. Okay, so what's the 4 or 5 conclusion, right? 3 or 4 features. One is that in this model, in this conception, religions, multiple religions are not an optional extra, but they are present from the very beginning, right? As part of the, sometimes as part of natural condition. It's not that there is just going to be one religion. There have to be many religions, and within the religion, there will never be one interpretation of the core beliefs and practices. There will always be several interpretations, right? Number one. And number two, the ends for which you would want separation can never be pigeonholed and neatly classified into just one category. There have to be multiple ends, which multiple ends have to be interpreted both individualistically and non-individualistically. Number three, that separation, therefore, for these two reasons, separation can never mean mere exclusion of either mutual or one-sided variety. But it has to be what I call principal distance, which I've already explained. And fourth, that you don't really have to choose between passive respect, which is more or less embodied in the mutual exclusion model on the part of the state, or active hostility, which is there in varying degrees in the idealized one-sided exclusion model, but that you don't have to choose between the two. What you can have is critical respect, namely the idea that it's precisely because you care for something that you wish to remove any filth that has got into it. So it embodies the notion of critical respect. And of course, this is a model that I've elsewhere called contextual secularism. Now, last point is that this idea also introduces into the discourse a completely novel conception of social and political secularism, which is not anti-religious, which is not non-religious, but which is against institutionalized religious domination in both its forms, inter and intra. So secularism itself is conceived as a perspective or as a stance against institutionalized domination. And it depends. If there is no such domination, then there's no need for secularism. And if to the extent that there is going to be institutionalized religious domination anywhere, you will need it, right? So it's not something which has to be, secularism itself doesn't really have to be part of our natural condition, as it were, as beliefs, as faiths and worldviews have to be. But if there is going to be institutionalized religious domination of any kind, then secularism will have to come into play.
And now to Professor Raday, who will talk about secular constitutionalism vindicated. Thank you.
Yes, following on straight on from what we've just heard, and with some envy, because this is also being presented as something that exists somewhere on the globe, and doesn't look as if it's an even utopian possibility from where we're sitting here in Tel Aviv. I want to say that looking at the different topics that we have on the table, divided societies, and then in our session, democracy, constitutionalism, and secularism. Yes, division is not only inter-group, inter-religious, non-religious groups. It's inter and intra. I was going to talk about it as horizontal and vertical. In other words, we have to deal with, naturally, heterogeneous societies and groups and individuals and opinions. We are not in a homogeneous world. And actually, we probably don't want to be in a homogeneous world. So we start off very strongly from divided societies. I think in the earlier sessions we heard about divided societies as tribal, kind of the divisions between the different tribes within the Constitution. No, the divisions also go down into and within the groups. Secularism. If we're going to talk about secularism, why secularism? Why not liberalism? Why is secularism important? And what kind of secularism are we talking about? Well, I agree, we're not talking about secularism as atheism or even agnosticism. We're not talking about individual belief systems. We're not even talking about communal belief systems. Or I, at least, am talking about constitutional secularism or secular constitutionalism. And why is that important? It is important because it is the most enabling form for pluralism. Pluralism as protected by human rights. Human rights are based on a secular view of the world, and I quote Ariely, who has analysed the way in which secularism developed. We all know it from French secularism onwards. Secularism was introduced to prevent religious hegemony being politically on the political scene, dominating the politics of the state. And originally it was between religions. It was so that different religions, Protestantism, Catholicism, could survive in the same constitutional realm. In other words, secularism is maybe in itself not a value system, but it enables values, and it enables human rights values. And that is what is important for democracy. Because the kind of democracy I am talking about is not numerical democracy. It's not narrow democracy, thin democracy, participatory democracy alone. It is the kind of democracy which respects the human rights of all those who participate within it. And without that, in fact, there's no true participation, because if the people participating in democracy don't have the human rights of liberty and equality, they cannot truly participate in any case. So why secularism? Why not liberalism? After all, we have a long liberal tradition. Why not liberalism? Well, the reason I have moved to talking about secularism is because of the liberal attacks on the idea of the secular constitution. A lot of liberal thinking now has become anti-secular. A lot of liberal thinking has started moving towards the idea of religious pluralism, because it started off with multiculturalism, communitarianism. After all, they said liberalism is just another fighting creed. It's just another belief. And as a fighting creed, I'm quoting people like Taylor and Horowitz, for example, or Kennedy, who talked about humanism as being idolatry. In other words, there is here a move amongst liberals to deny the validity of the liberal state as being enabling, rather than being just another belief system, ideological system, which is in itself a hegemony. And secularism, I think, has the advantage also of not being associated with liberalism, which has become another term for what is modern capitalism. And secularism is not associated with these different choices of an economic system of organization. The challenges by liberals include what I've said, which is the symmetry thesis. There is the challenge by liberals, which has been, and I'm talking about liberal academics, it's taken for granted, of course, in my view, that there has been an enormous religious backlash against the concept of the secular state, but I'm not talking about that, because the religious revival, actually, to at least those of my generation, has been rather a surprising development. I don't think we expected this across-the-board revival of religious orthodoxy. I'm not even going to say fundamentalism, religious orthodoxy across the globe. Coming back to, so I'm talking about the attacks by liberals, by academics, by liberals, by human rights activists, attacks on the concept of the liberal state as being the way of organizing interactions between different groups and individuals, both horizontally and vertically. So another kind of attacks that's come on secularism has come from a group of people. John Gray, Black Mass, is one of them. There are other books by Emmanuel Sivan and others on strong religions, where they talk about aggressive liberalism, aggressive secular utopias they talk about. And they take the 20th century, the history of the 20th century, and look at the tens of millions of people killed in the 20th century. This was secular utopianism, and it therefore delegitimizes the claim that secularism is an enabling philosophy, which is not in itself tainted by the crusading wars of the religions. But I would say, truly, you cannot say that the 20th century disasters were motivated by religion. That's true. And some of these secular utopians utopias were indeed anti-religious. I'm talking specifically about the communist regime. On the other hand, they were not for secularism as a regime that enables human rights. They were anti-religious. The anti-religiousness of these movements is in no way justified by secular constitutionalism. Because one of the main, or one of the central tenets of secular constitutionalism is freedom of religion. Freedom of religion is in all the human rights instruments, not in all the human rights, it's those that deal with the multiplicity of human rights. And so the totalitarianism of the 20th century, true, was not religious, but the reaction to the horrors of that non-religious totalitarianism was the Declaration of Human Rights, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. That was in reaction to those wars and disasters, and therefore you see that there is an opposition. Secular constitutionalism, the value content of secular constitutionalism is the human rights regime, which protects both inter and intra, or horizontal and vertical divisions, pluralism in society. The religious revival has brought to the fore the fact that there is a clear clash between orthodox religions and between human rights values. It is certainly true that religions provide, and this is one of the claims of the academic advocates of religious pluralism, may provide social solidarity, or does provide social solidarity, trust, mercy, and so on, communitarianism. But it comes at the expense, which seems to be pretty well consistent across religions, of ideological hegemony, which excludes the non-believer as not being totally entitled in the way the believer is entitled, which excludes women and homosexuals from full equality, which denies freedom of conscience and freedom of other religions to the same extent as the religion in itself, the I religion, my own religion. Israel is a very good example of this. In the basic law of human dignity and liberty, we have the missing rights, and the missing rights because of the religious lobby. And the missing rights are the right to equality, freedom of conscience, and freedom of religion. There is no objection, incidentally, from other religious lobbies. It's not only it's true that it's the religious Jewish lobby that promoted this, but in fact, if one goes into it, there's not going to be any objection from the religious Muslim lobby to excluding these values, these rights, from the core rights of the basic law of human dignity and liberty. True that the Supreme Court has modified and the problem, but it's modified it at the cost of exposing itself to accusations of being an over-activist court and of appropriating to itself powers that were powers that truly belonged to the Constituent Assembly or to the Knesset, to the Parliament. Now, when I talk about religions, of course, religions are part of culture. And when I'm saying religions, I cannot ignore the fact that human culture has obtained, has given us many of these values which are incorporated in the religions. But why do I address religions in particular? Because unlike traditionalist cultures, religions are hardcore organizationally, they are hardcore ideologically, they are hardcore legally, and they are hardcore politically. The religions are, in fact, the hardcore of traditionalist culture. And if you talk about the Vatican on the world stage, the Vatican appears, the Catholic Church appears in human rights forums in the United Nations. The Islamic countries, and it's named the Islamic countries, not a particular ethnic group, the Islamic countries appear on the international human rights stage. And so religions have the power to exercise the kind of hegemony which just now Rajeev pointed out. The point of secular constitutionalism is to marginalize, to refuse to allow this religious hegemony to determine the political agenda of the democratic constitutional state. Now, when I look at I talk about secularism as enabling the human rights regime, it seems to me, and then I ask myself, when I am in discussions like this, it has seemed to me that there has been enormous progress made since 1948 in promoting the idea of international human rights, of state obligation to international human rights, of the connection between state constitution and international human rights. International organizations do not regard states as free to have constitutions which violate international human rights. Some of those rights are customary. If they're customary, then the state cannot even opt out of those human rights. Some of them are treaty rights. Vast numbers of states, the vast majority of states, have signed on to these international human rights treaties and have obligated themselves to carry out human rights through their constitutional and legislative systems into the political system. And yet, together with this discourse, we have a counter-discourse going on. I talked about it on the academic liberal level, but it's also happening on the international level. Before it's even developed into a fully fledged system, we have things like the new decision of the Human Rights Council that we have to pay more attention to traditional values in interpreting international human rights. Traditional values mean largely religious values, and incidentally, it was sponsored by Russia, supported by the Islamic State, but it was sponsored by Russia. We have the initiatives to turn to convert any form of sedition against religion, religious defamation, as the term, religious defamation, into it's something which is like racial incitement, and which obviously goes towards delegitimizing freedom of conscience and freedom of speech. So we have these moves beginning to appear on the international level before the international level has even been absorbed onto the constitutional level. And when we talk about top-down, bottom-up, the international level is top-down. This seeking for bottom-up, for having to search for social and political consensus regarding the constitutional values that we incorporate into our constitutional systems, seems to me a reversion to a pre-human rights discourse. Because the human rights discourse comes to limit the power of numerical majorities, of consensus, to undermine and violate the rights of minorities or of individuals on the basis of equality and liberty. The argument is going on across the globe. If you look at the cases that have come up in constitutional courts across the globe, I'm only going to mention them, I'm not going to go into the decision. But as we discussed this, as we heard this morning, the pendulum between courts and legislature on a series of issues which are classified as 1, family, polygamy, adultery, disobedience and divorce. That's marital status issues. 2, matrimonial property issues, purchase, matrimonial property and maintenance. 3, control of women's reproductive freedom and autonomy. 4, modesty and restrictive dress codes. 5, homosexuality. And 6, freedom of expression. Across the globe, we're having challenges being made both by those people who wish to be free of religious hegemony and by those who wish to express religious freedom even when that appears to clash with other forms of human rights. And you can see it being throughout Europe, in India, in Israel. You see it in different communities, democratic states across the globe. It has been said that this goes to the family. Well, it's true that the family and therefore to the tribe, but it goes to the family and the tribe. It also goes to the family and women. And I think that the gender issue is quite central, and women are particularly sensitive to the backlash to the human rights discourse which we are perceiving. I want to say something specific about minorities in Israel and why the determination that Israel is a Jewish state and the interpretation of the Jewish nature of the Israeli state as being a religious classification is extremely problematic for minority rights in Israel. Because to be an Israeli citizen for a minority, if Israeli citizenship is equated with Jewish religious citizenship, must be severely limited. Now then, how does that play out in terms of secularism? If one has a secular state of Israel, then it actually allows space, is enabling for various different forms of identification with the citizenship identity, with the constitutional identity. It allows Israel as a state for self-determination of the Jewish people, because that is one of the purposes of within the secular state. It allows recognition of the Muslim minority as a national minority within the umbrella of a secular state. And hearing the way in which the Indian secularism was actually enabling, I can't say this, maybe it's not worked perfectly, but was enabling for Muslim, Hindu, and neither Muslim nor Hindu. I mean, the secular identities, I think, is a model, really, for Israel to move forward, and has enormous importance both intra the Jewish community, which I very much empathized with and thought was extremely important for us, the way in which the clash between communities and the failure to give an umbrella which allows each to develop, in fact, stultifies reform within each of the communities. I think that the Jewish community, intra-Jewish community, is paying an enormous price for not functioning within under a secular umbrella, as is the Arab community, which is tied to Muslim identity, whether it wants to or not wants to be tied to such an identity. So it seems to me that's the way forward for the communities, intra and inter, within Israel, and indeed towards a more open debate with our regional environment. And I'll conclude with that.
Thank you very much. And now the discussion, our Hanni learner.
Thank you very much for these three thought-provoking and insightful papers. All three papers have articulated numerous issues specific to the case studies, Turkey and India, and in a more comparative way, Professor Raday's actual paper that I've read a little different than the presentation. So I'm gonna, if that's okay, I'm gonna discuss the paper where you presented in a more comparative way Western democracies engaging with religious disputes. There are so many material here that we could possibly discuss. Just as an example, the different understandings of secularism. I actually think I was surprised by your comment now. I thought that just according to your papers, you have a different understanding or a different perception of what secularism means, but we can maybe discuss that later. Just one point. It is amazing to think that only 10 years ago, the millennium issue of The Economist, they had an obituary of God of the concept of God, arguing that it is not relevant anymore to contemporary politics. While the papers raise many intriguing questions that deserve, as I said, much further discussion, time is limited, I thus am going directly to the heart of the question that this conference is all about, and that underpinned all three papers, and that is what should be the role of constitutions in addressing the challenges raised in deeply divided societies. And it seems to me that the three papers offer three different answers to this question. And in my comments, I'd like to sketch what I see as three models of democratic constitutions suggested by the papers. One, a rigid formal consociational constitution, a rigid formal liberal constitution, and a flexible, ambiguous political constitution. Discussing these three models together, side by side, highlights their advantages and their shortcomings, and I will very briefly go through some of them. While I greatly sympathize with I have great sympathy to the liberal model of constitutional secularism presented by in Professor Raday's paper, I'm doubtful as to the political feasibility of achieving such a constitution in fragmented societies. On the other hand, while it seems to me that the political model of an ambiguous or more flexible constitution, as Professor Bhargava suggests, it is much more feasible in deeply divided societies, it puts extraordinary burden on institutions such as the court and parliament, which may result with the undermining of their legitimacy and the weakening of the whole democratic order. May I just add as a preliminary comment that the comparison between the three papers is illuminating because all three papers address, and you actually mentioned that, they address the concept of deeply divided societies in a very in a particular way, in a similar way, you all address societies which are characterized by deep disagreements over fundamental norms and values. And usually these types of conflicts are associated with religious issues, either in the context of inter or intra-religious conflicts, as you've mentioned. But in any case, we're not talking about what you call tribal conflicts, divisions, where divisions are between ethnic groups competing for power, or multicultural societies such as Canada or Switzerland, which might be heterogeneous but still resting on common basis of liberal political culture of some sort. Although I have to say that after the referendum on the minarets in Switzerland, I'm not so sure this is true anymore. Going through the papers, we can see how each paper derives the function of constitutions from their particular contextual perspective. So first, Professor Ozbudun talked about consociationalism, according to which constitution is perceived as a formal, rigid mechanism for conflict resolution. It delineates the governmental institutions of the state and sets the ground rules for which allow different identity groups to live together under shared political order. Professor Ozbudun's proposal for consociational constitution for Turkey rests on a positive and instrumentalist conception of a written constitution. Arend Leipard, the initiator of this model of a consociational democracy, found a strong link between consociational arrangements such as power sharing, proportionality, and the mutual veto principle, and constitutionalism. Constitutions prevent strong communities from executing their majoritarian preferences. His whole theory is based on the Netherlands case, the amendment of the constitutional amendment from 1917. But even if consociational arrangements are, some of them are informal, the main criticism against associational constitutions is that they tend to entrench identity divisions within the state institutional framework and ultimately perpetuate polarization rather than resolve it. Israel is an interesting case to mention in this context. Israel by no means is a consociational democracy, but still during its first decades it adopted consociational arrangements to address the conflict between Orthodox and secular Jews. These arrangements, known as the religious status quo, were not entrenched in a formal constitution. Nevertheless, despite their informality, in retrospect, they have proven to be resistant to change. Some principles included in the religious status quo, such as the religious hegemony on matters of marriage and divorce and the ban on public consultation in Shabbat and Saturday, turn out to be very difficult to change. Another problem with the consociational constitution is that by accepting the principle of mutual veto between conflicting groups, these constitutions tend to include provisions which compromise individual rights. To use Israel as an easy example again, the consociational arrangements in the area of family are notorious for their discrimination against women, homosexuals, interfaith couples, and non-believers. Some constitutional theorists might argue that consociationalism prevents constitutions from fulfilling what is arguably their primary function, that of regulating and restricting the exercise of governmental power and protecting individual rights. By giving up this normative aspect of constitutionalism and maintaining merely their positive function in the formation of governmental institutions, consociational constitutions surrender some of the accomplishments of modern constitutionalism and return to what may be seen as even Aristotelian understanding of constitution, the politeia, where the standard of its goodness, as Carl Friedrich said, was its stability, its durability, its effectiveness in maintaining the particular values and beliefs intact. By contrast, a normative perception of the Constitution is clearly presented in Professor Raday's paper, the written paper. From her perspective, didn't mean to. From her perspective, a consociational constitution, I think that from your perspective, a consociational constitution is somewhat of an oxymoron because it may include provisions which infringe upon basic human rights. When it comes to conflict between individual rights and collective rights, Professor Raday's concept of liberal constitution is uncompromising. In her view, I hope I'm right, the central role of constitutions is to provide first and foremost, and here I quote, an infrastructure of rights which deny the hegemony of religion and provide a forum, conceptual and jurisdictional, for challenging religious dictates. Constitutionalism, according to Professor Raday, presumes secularism in its most restrictive sense. Constitutions do not merely provide with a procedural framework for collective policymaking, divorced from any religious considerations. If any clash occurs between religion and human rights, constitutions are not expected to be neutral. They should establish a hierarchy in which rights to equality and to freedom of expression or conscience take precedence over the right to manifest one's religion. However, today, as Professor Raday acknowledges, almost no domestic constitution has explicitly articulated such hierarchy, which can only be found in two international treaties that you cite in your paper. It would be interesting to ask why this is the case. Perhaps because, in contrast to Raday's ideal secular constitutions, in practice, constitutions are ultimately political documents representing political compromises written by politicians. International treaties drafted by lawyers are much more closely resemble Raday's ideal constitution. However, one may ask to what extent international treaties are indeed considered as binding law compared with domestic constitutions. And I know this is a huge question, which I hope we'll discuss tomorrow morning when we have the panel on constitutionalism and the international order. On the domestic level, Professor Raday, like Professor Ozbudun, acknowledges the importance of consensus and of social support for enacting or amending constitutional provisions. Professor Ozbudun states the importance of consensus, as I said, fundamental constitutional change, and Professor Raday mentions regulation in accordance to the prevailing norms of the time. But what happens when there is no consensus regarding the prevailing norms of the time? Under such conditions, are constitutions the appropriate arena for resolving conflicts? Is the constitutional toolbox appropriate for addressing religiously related conflicts? And as Andres Saggio claimed in a recent article, constitutional secularism in Europe in European democracies is vulnerable precisely because religion-state arrangements in these countries are based on what he calls half-hearted compromises that were achieved throughout decades, if not centuries, of political struggle, what he terms the unfinished business of secularization. And this raises a practical question concerning the possibilities for institutional change, under which conditions societies divided over its most fundamental norms and values may draft or adopt as a constitutional amendment the ideal liberal constitution advocated by Professor Raday, or the constitutional rigid constitution proposed by Professor Ozbudun. As one philosopher wrote in the context of the Israeli debate on religion and state, he wrote, what is missing are not proposals for possible solutions, rather the real problem is the lack of political will in implementing what is already possible. We've also heard that from Dan Meridor last night. How to generate such political will is a big question. Luckily, I don't have time to discuss it right now. So I'd like to move on to Professor Bhargava's paper, and the question of political will is at the heart of his analysis of the Indian Constitution and the process of its drafting. In contrast to the ideal type constitution, and also in contrast to the elite-made constitution, it is eventually constitutional, it is elite-made arrangement. He presents, Professor Bhargava presents a more flexible political conception of democratic constitution. This model is easier to achieve since it does not force unequivocal decisions at the moment of constitutional drafting, but rather allows for internal inconsistencies within the constitutions. Within the Constitution. The Indian Constitution, on the one hand, is geared toward bringing about profound social transformation. It does not provide clear, unequivocal principles for resolving conflicts between competing visions of the state. These are to be resolved by future parliaments. As Professor Bhargava wrote somewhere else in a I think very important book called The Politics and Ethics of the Indian Constitution. He writes, the Indian Constitution reflects the faith in political deliberation. And a good example, in my view, which he didn't mention in the paper, and actually I was wondering why, but I think it supports very much your claim, is Article 44, the Uniform Civil Code in the Indian Constitution. If you read the Constituent Assembly debates around this provision, you'll see that it provides a good example for how constitutional ambiguity was used as a deliberate strategy for addressing religious tensions. It is not only a good example for it is also a good example for the shortcomings of constitutional provisions based on political compromises. Article 44 recommends the unification and secularization of family law in India. Because it is part of the non-justiciable section of the Constitution, it cannot be enforced by court. And eventually, this secularization of family law was implemented only for the Hindu majority, but not for the Muslim minority. And the result is that while Hindu women are protected by state law against patriarchal religious traditions, Muslim women, at least it is argued by some, are abandoned by the state. In the clash between principles of liberty and equality on the one hand and religious group rights on the other hand, the Constitution does not provide here a clear hierarchy of rights. And in that sense, okay. So, and indeed for over 60 years now, this article continues to steer public, political, and judicial debate in India. Finally, the problem with ambiguous constitutions is that they blur the distinctions between higher lawmaking and ordinary lawmaking. And when Professor Bhargava writes that the reform within Hinduism can hardly be initiated without help from without help from power-eternal institutions such as the state, it is not clear which organ of the state should promote these reforms, whether it should be achieved through constitutional provisions, or amendments, through ordinary legislation by Parliament, or through judicial decisions. This question is particularly important in deeply divided societies because, and this is very clear in Israel, under conditions of deep ideological disagreements or normative disagreements, the institutional tension between the branches of government inherent to any democratic system, these tensions may overlap with the conflict over norms and values, and thus weaken the legitimacy of these democratic, of these institutions themselves. If courts and parliaments are perceived as taking side in the battle over the character of the state, their legitimacy may be undermined in the eyes of the opposing camp. So here we are back full circle to the institutional question again. I've so far discussed the differences between the three models of democratic constitutions suggested by the papers. I would like to point in my concluding remark to one interesting commonality between them, and also to raise one or two questions for further discussion, if I may. I don't have time?
3 minutes.
Okay, 3 minutes. Even two. None of the proposed constitutional models for deeply divided societies suggested a purely procedural concept of democratic constitution. In all three papers, the Constitution included explicit references to issues which were at the heart of the conflict in the different contexts. Divisive, issues were not taken off the agenda, but rather addressed heads-on in the different constitutional models. Perhaps maybe the Indian constitution deviates slightly from the rule, from this rule, in that it includes ambiguous principles, yet even the Indian constitution had a particular agenda in promoting national reforms. As I said at the beginning, there are many more issues to discuss, and I would just like to raise maybe a few questions as a conclusion. First, is there an important theoretical distinction between constitutions written by divided societies and not so deeply divided societies? Or more particularly, do religious conflicts pose particularly complex challenges to constitutional theory, different in its type from challenges posed by other types of identity conflicts, ethnic, national, racial, etc.? And finally, does this mean that we are to give up the hope for a grand theory of constitution making which would apply to all types of societies? The philosopher Mick Jagger said once, you can't always get what you want. This applies not only to the dilemma of constitution making in divided societies, but also to my attempt to complete my comments within 15 minutes. Thank you.
Thank you very much. We'll now open the floor for questions. Let's start from here. Please, everyone, present yourself. Michael.
Michael Chesson, Tel Aviv University. 2 points. One, snarky Professor Raday. Justice Jackson, I think, said the Constitution is not a suicide pact. But on her description of customary international law, it's a categorical commandment to suicide. That's to say, if we have an unworkable norm of customary international law, it can't be changed. It's a top-down process. There's no room for amendment. And I find that kind of strange. But back to the question for Professor Bhargava. When you say that the Indian Constitution bans untouchability, what does that mean in practice? What exactly is banned and how effective is this?
I have a point concerning...
Please present.
So I am Susanna Mancini from the University of London. Now, Francis, we had this conversation before, but I am less optimistic in the great virtues of secularism, at least the way it is applied in European societies, because in Europe, secularism is really the historical process of separation between the state and a Christian church. Therefore, it corresponds to a Christian logic, and it ends up by favoring the Christian and accommodating the Christian majority. I mean, think of the French headscarf law, which prohibits kippas, turbans, and crucifixes of manifestly exaggerated dimensions. This is obviously a discriminatory attitude. So my problem is that secularism can become aggressive if you view it from this perspective, and in fact it ends up by failing in protecting the religious rights of religious minorities.
Yes, this is to Francis. Usually I'm acquainted with the debate in France about this laiciste de combat, the more liberal type of laicity. And one of the issues is the problem that secularism means national. This is the basic claim of laiciste de combat. That it probably, doesn't work. What's your opinion about that? Where do you stand on that?
Last question in this one. Yes. Yeah.
Moshe Baron from the Open University of Israel. I would like to address my question to Francis Raday. I believe you said something about the religious lobby in Israel being responsible for non-secularism in Israel. I don't think this is true. I think that the idea of the Jewish state, almost by definition, means that secularism is impossible. Because the Jewish state identifies both religion and nationality. Therefore, it is impossible to move in the Indian direction. Because in India, there is a recognition of the Indian nation which makes it possible for Muslims and for Hindus to be equal. There is no such idea of an Israeli nation, and Israeli nation is not recognized here. So I believe there are two different issues here. Therefore, it is not true that what is missing in Israel is a political will or a will. What is missing is a recognition by Israeli Academy among the rest that Israel is not a normal, it is not a nation state in fact, to re-establish Israel as a nation state and then deal with all the problems, the important problem of secularism and other issues.
We'll have whoever wants to start, please. It's already.
Okay, whatever
Yeah,
you
yeah.
want.
Whoever wants to start.
I think I have do I have 2 hours? I think a lot of things came up. Firstly, the idea that whether constitution making in religiously divided societies is different from constitution making where the divisions are different, like language in Canada, or socialist, conservative, different kinds of. Yes, I think that it's more difficult when we're talking about religion, because I think that the concept of religious ideological hegemony does really poses a threat to the democratic state and to constitutional authority, which is not posed by other kinds of division in the same way. And I try to refer to that when I talk about religion as the hard core, in fact, the hard core of cultural traditionalism, but also of a hegemonic authority. I mean, the more orthodox forms of some religions, at least, and certainly Judaism and Islam amongst them, does not really admit of a higher source of authority than the religious authority itself, which poses a problem for constitutional making. So that's the first point I wanted to make. The second point I wanted to make about secularism can become aggressive. If secularism is, as I regard it, defined in that way, as enabling, I don't see how it becomes aggressive. The fact that it is being applied in ways which are not consonant with its constitutional function as an enabling, it enables challenges. That is important. It enables challenges. I don't think we have the answer to all the challenges made, because the challenges come on the scene between individual rights and group rights. But as long as secular constitutionalism allows those challenges, it at least allows an open society in which the challenges can be made in a public forum and have to be answered. And I think that itself, even without the answers laid out all the way along the line, is an extremely important function that cannot take place in a religious pluralist or in a religious theocratic or theodemocracy, if one wants to call it that. The idea that secularism is nationalism and aggressive in that sense, well, since the World War II, the literature points to religious nationalism rather than to secular nationalism. And as I pointed out, the kind of nationalism with secular nationalism in World War II, or before, around that period of time and up to World War II, was in fact not secularism as an enabler of human rights constitutionalism. It was really a form of atheism and anti-religious secularism, which of course I personally am not in any way endorsing. The idea of what I try to say about the Jewish state is that the Jewish state has been differently described by in different documents and by different groups of people as a Jewish state, meaning a Jewish religious state, or as a homeland for the Jewish people, which takes into account the Jewish people as a historical, cultural entity, which has had religious characteristics, but is not exclusively defined by religion. And if it's a homeland for the Jewish people, I think that allows the participation of others who are not religiously Jewish in a far more feasible way. And then I just want to finish with the thing about feasible, because Hanna, in her excellent synthesis of our synthesis and discussion of our three papers, did talk about whether liberalism is feasible. Well, I don't think anything else is feasible. I think that there is an illusion of feasibility in making the compromises that are made in the other models. But I certainly think that in Israel it's not working. And as I said, it is in fact stultifying development of the Jewish community, of the Muslim community, and of the interaction between them.
Shall I continue?
Please.
Okay. First of all, Hanna, regarding the question you raised, are deeply divided societies different from others, and do they present special problems in constitution making? I think my answer is yes. Deeply divided societies are different from more consensual societies where the rules of the game are shared by a wide majority of the people. Again, is the toolbox of constitutional democracy appropriate? Those were your words. There is no single blueprint for constitutional democracy, in my opinion. Leipart, the founder of this theory, so to speak, has suggested a number of ways. Some of them, as I pointed out, are easier to implement. Some are more difficult by their very nature. For example, I believe the mutual veto rules or concurrent majority is very, very difficult to accomplish in practice. The grand coalition may be a politically advisable device under certain conditions, but it cannot be legislated into a positive legal norm. But certain others are more easily implementable rules, such as proportional representation, broader powers to local government units, more extensive cultural rights, especially in the matters of education, a more multiculturalist approach. And of course, rigid constitutions, because a rigid constitution is a guarantee for the minority, which may or may not be enough to protect the minorities. Because after all, there is a certain point to the rigidity. Let's say two-thirds rule is a more or less common rule in most European constitutions. But in order to protect yourself, your minority should be over one-third. I mean, that is a very simple calculation. However, one point you mentioned is very important. Whether we give up certain things, especially in matters of human rights, when we make a consociational agreement. So certainly this is not my idea of consociationalism. Human rights should be protected even more strongly than the other provisions of the Constitution. We were discussing this during the lunch break. Maybe we would require a stronger qualified majority for amending the constitutional rules on human rights. Even though I am categorically and philosophically against the so-called eternal rules, absolute unamendable rules, here I am a Jeffersonian who has said that the dead has no right in constitution making. But certainly human rights can and should be protected more strongly than the other more technical features of the Constitution. Finally, a few words about Rajeev's presentation, because secularism is also a matter of very heated debate in my country. I am fascinated by your three model. My preference, both is personal, and I think it's the most suitable model for divided societies, is mutual non-interference. Neither the state should interfere in the affairs of different religious communities, nor vice versa. However, in the present Turkish case, it is a one-sided interference. The state interferes in religious affairs, but not the other way around. So this is part of the ongoing problem and ongoing debate. For example, on paper, the Turkish constitution is strictly secular. Even secularism is one of the unamendable characteristics of the constitution. But on the other hand, the Directorate of Religious Affairs is part of the governmental apparatus, and it serves only the Sunni population, not only to the exclusion of the non-Muslim groups, but also Muslims who are not Sunnis, such as the Alevis. So it is a state institution that performs all religious functions. And one may question what kind of non-interference here. Actually, what we have is a one-sided interference. The Indian system is very, very intriguing, but I'm sure you agree that it would require a very enlightened leadership, because where to support and where to hinder, if you don't subject them to strict rules, you always have to make decisions on the merit of each case, which is a difficult job, and I wish we can have in my country such an enlightened leadership.
Okay. Yeah. Okay. So, first of all, Michael, right? Here, there is a constitutional article which bans non-participation. So it's constitutionally.
What is that? What are you not allowed to do under this bill?
You can't touch them.
No, well, I mean, do you understand? Sorry.
I know a little bit.
You know a little bit. So,
what conduct is prohibited by the constitutional ban?
I mean, many examples. For example, if there is an outcast who wants to draw water from a well, but who is prohibited from doing so because he's an outcast, now if anybody prevents him, he will be behind bars. Just today, if there is an outcast who wants to go into a temple where he was earlier forbidden to go into the temple, then if anybody prevents him from doing it now, he'll be behind bars.
This is in fact the case.
No.
This is enforced.
No, I never said that.
I'm asking.
No. I'll give you an answer. It's pretty effective. It's pretty effective, as and when somebody brings it to the I mean, it's uneven. I mean, there are lots of places where it's completely ineffective. India is a huge country, right? I mean, I'm not saying that it's effective everywhere. I mean, it's obviously it's ineffective in a lot of places. There are large parts of the country where the upper caste have really, there's a huge backlash, and people will just not have enough courage to go to the police station to register a case. And even if they were to go there, the case will not be registered by the police. So there's no question of legal prosecution. But I don't think this can happen in any major town or city now, which was pretty common at one time. So, I mean, and these are just examples. I'm even talking about physical touch. I mean, if I were to if an untouchable was to touch me, I could do various things to that person, right? Today, if he physically touched me, there is nothing that I can do. I can't. I mean, if I were doing some purification ritual, I could be put in the bath. Because that fellow can then say that these guys, this is practicing untouchability. Okay, yeah, I mean, it's not effective everywhere, but I think it is solely because, of course, there's a huge social movement before something like that could happen in 1950, that constitutionally, it could be banned. And that movement included all sorts of people, it wasn't just a Dalit-led or untouchable-led movement. It was a movement that had all sorts of people, Gandhians and Nehruvians, Ambedkarites, and so on. Okay, let me briefly turn to Hanna's. I'll try to be very brief, although I've got millions of things to say on. But I really want to hear more questions. But very quickly, this issue which was raised by both of you. I mean, on the question of feasibility, but a lot of burdens being placed on the institution. I think we really have no option. And when I say we, I mean we, not just Indians. Because the alternative to that is continuing civil war or oppression of other communities or oppression of members of communities, or radical homogeneity, which is what happened, mass expulsions, massacres, or at best modus vivendi, some kind of a temporary truce, where as soon as one side gains more power, it will oppress the other. That's the option. Now, so you have all these institutions, and together, not just all these institutions, but even outside political institutions, I mean, it's the work of a whole lot of people. It's multiple. It's grounded in multiple agencies and multiple institutions, and it takes a long time. I mean, somebody mentioned how. Take for example the headscarf issue. See, it was raised in France in 1989. The matter is referred to the Council d'État after some time. And the Council d'État says, well, there's nothing incompatible the wearing of the headscarves is not incompatible with license. That's 1992 or 93. What happens in 2004? Look at from 89 to 2004, things change, and finally a decision comes up. But a lot of, it's 15 years before something comes up. And that's the nature of all important political decisions. They take a long time. And there are all sorts of factors who get involved in it. And I think there's no point saying that there should be one agency or one institution and there should be an unambiguous rule which must be implemented by this institution. And that's the way to resolve things. I don't think that's the way to do it. It's a way of forgetting that thing. See, and it's a way of upsetting a whole lot of people. I mean, imagine if the matter went straight away to the courts in France, and within a year you got a decision one way or another. Do you think the thing would have been settled? It would have, there would be other kind of turmoil taking place in France. So yeah, I mean, if it's feasible, then place the burdens on everybody, all citizens, all institutions, to see it through. Otherwise, it will remain unfeasible. Maybe the liberal is, I don't know, purely liberal, because mine has got some very interesting connections with the liberal, although it's not exclusively liberal. And the same is true of ambiguity. I think this ambiguity in deeply divided societies is very ambiguous, is very fruitful. The Indian Constitution is seen as a resource by a very large number of people today. That was not the case when it was first instituted. Today, I can say confidently that except for the extreme Hindu right, and of course for extreme left, and for some sections who still have not been fully included in the whole process, there are some Dalits and some people in the Northeast and so on, I think by and large one can say confidently that Dalits, women, the poor, everybody sees the document as something which can be seen as a resource for them. And that's possible only because it's ambiguous between different things. And it doesn't always lead to ambiguous and wishy-washy results. You see, the ambiguity of the document can lead to definite and clear results. The outcomes are not always, in this kind of ambiguous process, the outcomes are not always going to be favorable to you. It's very clear, and this is true of democracy in any case. But even constitutional democracies of the kind of constitution that I'm talking about, it will not favor you all the time. But that's part of the deal. You see, if you either live in a system where everything is going to be in your favor or nothing, or you live in a system where some things will go in favor of what in your favor, quite a bit of the time, and you hope that it will become better next time. And I think that hope is there in the Constitution, despite all the problems.
May I address one question to you? And this is really about Muslim women, and it was brought up already. And there is a lot of this literature which claims that actually Muslim women have been abandoned in the ambiguity, in the compromises made for communal peace. How do you address that? And how does that bode for the development of the Muslim minority? Because I don't regard women as I regard women as half of Muslim society. So how does that bode?
Well, that's obviously that's one of the big sort of points of vulnerable points. The thing is that the matter gets complicated the moment you have another group which is posing a threat. I mentioned that. You see, the moment two groups start seeing each other as menace, then you are asked to close ranks because you believe that if anybody dissents or anybody wants an internal reform, then the whole community will wither. And the fact is that the burden of carrying the identity of the whole community, which is supposed to remain, one, that burden is always carried by people who have been historically disadvantaged, particularly women. And that's exactly what it is a big impasse in Indian politics. All those people who were in favor of a common civil code which is gender just, because they fear in Muslims as well as non-Muslims, secularists as well as liberal communitarians, all of them today are they are frozen. They don't know which way to go because they fear the Hindu right. And of course, it's extremely unjust and unfair to women. Now, to Muslim women, you've got to just recognize it and wait for an opportunity to do something. I think we had an opportunity in 1970. We missed it. We could have introduced a reform then. We did it in the 50s. At that time, perhaps it wasn't right. You've got to get people from the community involved in this, and they were too. The partition had just taken place, but in the 70s there was late 60s and 70s, early 70s, an opportunity, a space had been created, but that space was lost. I mean, people did nothing about it, and we are paying the price for it. I mean, Muslim women are paying the price.
Our time is up, so I don't know. Can we push the
limit? We started 10 minutes late.
So okay, good. So we'll take yes, 4 more questions. Quickly, please.
Well, there was an extremely persuasive presentation of Indian model, but I wonder if it was not too persuasive because special situation which brought it forth, namely the intense conflict that led to the partition, and then the great poverty and the social inequality characteristic of India, then I think motivate much of what you described. And for that reason, I really wonder why many other countries should really be particularly interested in this model. I'm comfortable with the American model, I have to say. I'm very critical of American politics in most ways. I'm not sure if you described it correctly, by the way.
I didn't describe the model.
Well, you didn't, but you said one thing about it, which I didn't think was right, and I mean even Gary's book indicates, which obviously you know, the American state does interfere.
No, I know that.
Polygamy cannot be practiced. Scientists have to give their children insulin. It's true that in some domains they don't interfere where I think they should, like education. But I mean, there's many domains they do interfere. If some Hindus still wanted to practice the burning of widows,
in the interest of others.
I would say that before we bury what people might be uncomfortable with as Western-centric models of separation, we should perhaps consider whether these models are still alive. Oh, by the way, in Europe too, there are many versions of it, and some are quite alive and well.
Thank you. Excuse me, did you want to? Okay, so please.
The question is just about that. If I understood correctly, you say that the question of the intervention of the state in matters of religion is tending ultimately to the extent to which it will reduce intra forms of domination. Can we, however, propose that the dynamics with which things took place in India since independence were such that the state unwittingly, via the Constitution, I will say how in a minute, the dynamics was such that the state unwittingly perpetuated those intra forms of domination. When we talk about Hindus, one example, Hindus get via the Constitution affirmative action. But what happened in the designation of these policies, the state actually conflated issues of religion with caste, and this fusion contributed to the formation of a homogenized composite Hindu identity, thus glossing over deep caste class divisions and perpetuating this form of domination. In fact, the Constitution divorced religion from caste when we know that Muslims also have caste-like divisions, and therefore construing them as a homogenized religious minority, thus perpetuating this form of domination. An issue that becomes even more complex in the 90s, when the whole issue of, and even today, when the whole issue of Dalit Muslims and Dalit Muslims is on the agenda.
Okay, so, and the last one.
Well, I just wanted to make it follows on what's been said slightly. I think the difference among the panelists, I see it, at least on one important matter, is that Francis and Rajeev seem to be suggesting the transportability of their model. This is the appropriate model that is realistic in a variety of settings. I understand, Ergun, your position for consociation is limited. You're saying, well, this is appropriate for Turkey, but you're not suggesting.
No, I'm not suggesting, but
it beyond that. And so, for example, the idea of principal distance, which you make a marvelous defense of for India, after all, does assume the existence of certain principles by which these very complicated decisions, as you put it, can be made. Those principles are articulated in the document, directive principles and so forth, and the question is whether in such societies lacking that kind of principle direction, this is a model that we would want to suggest for them. It may be one of the more admirable statements about the Indian experiment is that these principles seem to be more or less abided by, and therefore the contextual secularist solution that you're proposing works there. But I'm a little skeptical, perhaps I misheard you, in your desire or your expectation that it might be appropriate beyond
I was shown that session a number of persons have
seems that the Ergun is with you.
Yeah, maybe I did say something which led to this misunderstanding, but I was talking about the logic of the model itself. If you were to take it, fully, if you really follow the logic of the model, then it leads to that. I didn't actually say that, the American state actually follows it. I believe, as a matter of fact, that in a lot of ways, the American model also follows principal distance, not mutual exclusion. But it's a fact that when people think of the American model, very often, and particularly, both some of their articulators in the liberal tradition in America, as well as people who read about this model elsewhere, certainly the one that has been imported everywhere, that is the model of mutual exclusion, wall of separation, right? I don't think that conforms to, the practice of the American state conforms to that model, but that's certainly and that's why I kept talking about the self-idealization, the self-understanding, and so on and so forth. I don't think that I don't want to make the claim that the Indian version is importable, exportable, transportable. I just think that it's relevant in deeply diverse societies. By relevant, I don't mean that people should imitate it. By relevant, I mean that people should read more about it. There's nothing wrong in claiming that, because you see, it's like so many other things. It's just not on anybody's map. There are, when people think of secularism, they don't think of Indian secularism. They think about laicity. They think about the American version. They think about even Turkey. But they don't think about India, except in very, very recently, in the last few years. So I think it's just it's only appropriate that it should be presented in a way which makes it seem like transportable. But in fact, I don't care. That's up to people. Otherwise, it's inconsistent with my idea of contextual and multiple secularisms. Okay, I think about Onis' point. I agree. People didn't see it like that in the 1950s, though. No Muslim could have accepted that there are castes in Muslim societies. So they couldn't have, of course everybody knew, but the Christian could have accepted there are castes in Christian society. So only Hindus could say openly, because they were fighting, that this, and that's what got into the Constitution. And of course, in a few years' time, it is evident. And a lot of people have been saying that, look, you're giving affirmative action to castes, but why only to Hindus? You should give them to Muslims and Christians and so on. But it doesn't. This is one of the things about the rigidities of the Constitution. No matter how flexible it is, it's not that easy to change it. And so it doesn't really, it hasn't moved beyond Hindus to Christian, and there's a lot of resistance from within Christians and Muslims as well, because that is to admit something. That is to admit this contamination. How could they do that? How could we? So it's a complicated issue. I don't think the Christian clergy and the Muslim imams who give the fatwas are going to be very happy admitting that there are castes in their communities.
There's a point at which there's a meeting, actually, between the idea of principles and the institutions. And it seems to me that the idea of non-interference by the state, or restraint from interference by the state in religions, obviously is correct in the sense that it's not invasion of the religion by the state. But, as we've heard, that the principles of human rights should be given a priority within the Constitution. And as you have said, Rajeev, you wait for the opportunity to allow Muslim women to claim their citizenship rights to equality. rather than being trapped within a sub-community in India which actually deprives them of those rights, then how do we keep that on the agenda? And it seems to me that constitutional principle is the way of keeping it on the agenda. And that if the compromises are made, the compromises have to be made at a rather different level. And in fact, in India, they were made that way, because whereas the Supreme Court made principal decisions on equality for Muslim women, or some forms of equality for Muslim women, it was the legislature which stepped in and said, okay, we can't maintain this at the moment. So then, for example, I believe in the Canadian concept of the override. So keep your constitution maintaining the right of every person and group in the state to liberty and equality, and then say where the legislature has to postpone this, it will step in with an override clause and postpone it. But if you don't maintain your courts with this agenda, this human rights agenda, as an ongoing agenda, then I think you lose the message, you lose the plot. And so that is why I don't think that I'm feasible, or that I'm being rigidly liberal. That's what I'm talking about, secular enabling. And the question about what does this do for the Dalits, whether in practice it gives Dalits the right to enter all kinds of places, or whether it does in practice give Muslim women the right to object to polygamy, is not the point. Because you can't affect society down to the last individual. It opens the space for them to challenge the community which is oppressing them, and it opens the space for them maybe to exit out of that community. And both those, the ability to challenge, I think, is at the essence of secular constitutionalism.
One minor point. I mean, you're absolutely right about that. In India, your first option was that both Hindu and Muslim women will be governed by personal laws. But, you were born as Muslims or Hindus, and therefore it was assumed that you will be governed by, unless you exercise a choice of opting out of that and going for for a uniform civil code. And a common civil code, sorry. Now that common civil code was instituted in 1950. So that option was always there, and that space was created, and many women took that option. It was in 1986, and Shah Banu took that option. That is the problem. That's what happened. There was a backlash. And Shah Banu didn't want to be governed by Muslim personal law. She went to the Supreme Court, and Supreme Court upheld it and said, you are not going to be governed by it. So you will be governed by common civil code, and therefore you'll get the maintenance that every other woman gets, and not just for a period of 3 months. And after that, there is a whole series. And a new law is passed which overrides the common civil code. A new legislation, that is the real tragedy of India.
So that then you at least did become this override.
Thank you for the panelists, for stimulating presentation and for a lively discussion. Thank you.
Thank you.
Quarter to 5.
Quarter to 5. Enough time for a cafe.
I'm glad you said about human rights what you said.
Yes, of course. By constitutional agreement.